You'll all be seeing that now. So as Michael said, today we are going to be talking about DevSecOps and how do we align security to agile ways of working. The idea with this presentation is just to share some insights on my journey with understanding all those methodologies and how to apply security to it. And yeah, it's going to be a very conversational type of presentation, and I hope that you can get some insights and some good ideas. And as much as possible, I will try to share with you what I have tried to do, my failures, and what I have seen that worked in the past with some of the organizations that I worked with. In terms of what we are going to be covering today from a content perspective. So my intention today it is cover with you the difference between security and agile. I guess it's quite important that we do understand those differences in order for us to understand the gaps, and of course, then how to apply and how to remediate those gaps. We are also going to be discussing the difference between two models, which are going to be the central of the presentation today, being them DevOps, and the second one, CI/CD pipelines. Then we are going to be discussing the challenges and opportunities with those models. And finally, we are going to have a discussion on how do we, what we as security professionals or organizations can do to increase cyber awareness and the security resilience of when you are using those models. Cool, but just before we get started, I just want to make sure that I do introduce myself. You probably know by now that I am Vanessa Leite. It is a very difficult, last name to say. And the way that I do explain to people is that means milky in Portuguese. So you can always call me Vanessa Milk. So that's all good. I know that's a difficult one to say. And I am a principal at CyberCX. I have been with CyberCX for a couple of months now. It's been great experience, great bunch of people to work with. And yeah, it's been good. You potentially can tell by my accent that I am not from New Zealand. And the reason is because I'm born and lived most of my life in Brazil. I came to New Zealand in 2016, and since that I have been living here, and it's been a great experience for me and my family. In terms of professional experience and background in a very high level, so most of my career has been with security consultancy, architecture type of roles. And I have worked mainly with banks, financial institutions, and manufacturing organizations. In terms of areas of expertise, anything to do with developing new cybersecurity capabilities or reviewing the security of some solutions, especially from a technical standpoint, because I do love technology, are things that I have done a lot and I like doing. Cool. Me. Then next, and I guess where we start with all that, agile DevSecOps discussion, perhaps the best place to start with is defining and discussing the difference between agile and security. So over the years and across organizations, there has been a massive push for more agility with delivering new products and features to market. And because of that push, we have experienced in the last few years significant change in the way that we do software development. Companies such as Google, especially Google, tech companies, they have developed new and fast ways of delivering code change and launch their new features to market. And of course, Agile is in the center of all that. And for those of you who have worked with organizations that have undergone some sort of agile transformation, you must have experience and you must have seen that there is significant difference between agile and security. And perhaps the best way to describe is that they have competing goals, right? Different goals. And it's quite important that we do understand those differences in order for us to understand also how do we align those goals, or how do we find a balance. While Agile is more about incremental change to speed the release process, And it is also about, it has those principles that we all know in terms of, focus on conversation over documentation. Security is quite different than that. So traditional security, and by the way, we're all born in compliance and risk grounds. We have always been more at a systematic approach, more aligned to a systematic approach. And we have, traditionally work along with governance gates. So basically, security teams would provide, project teams with a set of requirements, and those teams would need to provide feedback and evidence that those requirements have been implemented. And at some point, we would provide them with a sign-off and the ability to go ahead and go live. But the reality is that if you are doing releases on weekly basis, for example, right? And we know that some companies, they say that tech companies, they actually do like, every few minutes releases, changing software in applications. You can't afford taking a week or several days to do a security assessment, right? So that model doesn't match with that, that way of working. And additionally, and I think that's quite important that we as security professionals, we do understand, delaying, those software changes, delaying the implementation of those features can be more damage to the business than not undergoing like a comprehensive security review, right? As security professionals, we all believe in, we want to make sure that people understand that security is very important, but the reality is that not always security is the most important thing, right? So that's something important for us to understand. And of course, that's not a new subject. It's not a new topic. Lots of people have been trying to address some of those gaps. And because of that, then we have, multiple methodologies and practices that have been developed to address that security gap. Just going to the next slide. And yeah, there is a lot of, methodologies out there. The ones that you guys are seeing in the screen, they are not all related to security. Some are, some are not. But I think that's important that we do acknowledge that there is a lot of methodologies and a lot of thinking that has been done on how do we address some of those issues. Ultimately, all those methodologies, they are seeking to enhance product release cycle through some sort of collaboration or automation. Today, we are going to be focusing on DevOps and CI/CD pipelines, but once more, it is important that you do understand at some extension that there are more methodologies because your organization might be using a different methodology and the principles in focus can differ a little bit, when we compare them all. So what I want to do now just quickly is just perhaps have a bit of a discussion and compare some of those methodologies and perhaps unpack some of the key components of each one of those methodologies. So then we do understand what they are about, what they focus on and how do they relate to each other as well. So in a very high level, Agile is about process change to enhance delivery. So that is Agile in a very high level. And of course, then lots of other methodologies, as we just discussed, have been created to support those Agile principles and way of working. DevOps and CI/CD pipelines are two examples which focus on software delivery process. So DevOps, as you probably know, it is about getting the developers and operational teams working together. In general, DevOps focus on a cultural change, focus on having those roles working together as part of the same team, and aims to increase collaboration. And the reason that is a good approach, is because just like we were discussing a minute ago about the difference between Agile and security, there are significant differences between, people that work with development and people that work with operations. The mindset and the goals are also different. So we normally say that developers, they will be focused on change, new features, innovation, while operational teams will be focused on stability, performance, maintaining those environments. So having those two teams working together potentially can provide organizations with a more comprehensive solution or a more balanced solution, right? The other way that I like describing, the way that I like to think about DevOps is that it is a model, right? And when you talk about DevOps, you are normally talk about operating model, a way of, working together, and as I said before, to increase collaboration. Then we have CI/CD pipelines, which stand for continuous integration and continuous delivery. And we normally see CI/CD pipelines in the context of DevOps. You don't need to have CI/CD pipelines as part of a DevOps team, but it is very unlikely that that's going to happen because CI/CD pipelines can provide, those DevOps teams with an agility and efficiency that it is so important that they normally end up, having some level of, automation in some pipelines. But in a very high level, CI/CD pipelines are about software-defined lifecycle. It is about having tools that can help you to implement automation. So automation is key here. And the reason that CI/CD pipelines is so important to the DevOps teams is because it is the engineering practice, or it is a methodology or method that can provide DevOps with the agility that they need, right? So you are likely going to be automating some of those repetitive tasks, and then you can have those DevOps teams focus on what matter, more, difficult problems to solve. And finally, you're going to see as well that, often we hear and we read that the CI/CD pipelines are the backbone of DevOps. So those two things, they walk hand in hand. Now, what I want to do is just get a little bit more deeper into those two models and just understand how they relate to each other and some of the key considerations that you should have, or key things that is important for us to understand. So the first one, as we just discussed it, DevOps is about the operating model. It's about, different roles working together to increase collaboration. And CI/CD is more like an engineering practice, and it's about automating things. When you talk about DevOps, we are also going to be talking about a life cycle, right? In the stages that you are seeing in the screen, plan, coding, building, testing, is part of the life cycle. And quite important, and that is, because of Agile, there is no beginning and end, right? At any time you can stop and apply change. It is a iterative, and consistent flow. Normally, a pipeline is going to align to the DevOps model, and you are going to have some automation to automate some of the key activities within each one of those steps of the lifecycle steps. It is, at the end of the day, a bunch of tools, and it is quite like that. There's multiple tools that you can be using, but you are normally going to hear about Jenkins and CodeFresh, which are one of the key tools that DevOps teams they use to do the automation. Jenkins and CodeFresh, they are called orchestrations or automation tools, and they are responsible for helping you to automate the continuous integration side of things and the continuous development side of things. Some teams, they will, and of course, we need to start in that journey. So you might see that your team don't have the full life cycle, don't have the integration and deployment side of things. They might only have the initial stage, but the aim is to automate as much as possible. The other thing is that it's important for us to understand, and in terms of pipelines, is that there is no such a thing as a single pipeline. Your organization is likely going to have several pipelines. Normally, you are going to have one pipeline per application, and that pipeline is going to be managed by a DevOps team, which is responsible for a given application. But the reality is that even a single application might have many pipelines. It is depending on the way that your DevOps team is structuring that, right? And the reason I'm saying that is because then you do need to understand that you are going to have some complexities. And the first one is with the fact that you do have multiple pipelines now that you need to integrate your security capabilities with, right? So that adds complexity. And you should potentially have an inventory, know all those pipelines. So it's important that you do understand that it's not going to be just one or few, potentially can be, hundreds. I have worked with organizations that had, multiple pipelines across multiple applications, and that's very complex sometimes. The other thing that you do need to understand as well, and you might have experience, is that depending on the application that pipeline is managing, you are going to have a different set of tools. So having a blueprint and having the same tools being used sometimes is not what happens. So if you have a DevOps team who is responsible for a mobile application that is has been developed for iOS, that team is likely going to have different tools than the team that's managing the Android, application, because normally you have two different teams because two different skill sets. So it is important that you do understand that we will have some difference with that tooling. And that's another complication, another challenge for security teams, because then you need to understand, have some level of understanding of all those tools. And each one of those pipelines will be using different tools. And it's just, again, more complexity and more things for us to keep in mind. Since we are talking about complexities, I just want to expand a bit more on challenges and risks, and some of the things that we need to keep in mind when thinking about security. So the first one, and you probably know that, but just important that we do emphasize and highlight that, is that those pipelines, they are critical piece of infrastructure. And the reason is because they do have access to different environments, and that access normally is highly privileged. So it is important that you do understand that those pipelines, they might be targets, or they might be interested, a channel for cyber criminals to exploit in order to compromise the organization or other specific applications. CyberCX, we have them, as part of some of the pen testing that we do, and as part of some of the red teaming that we also do. We have demonstrated that it is possible to compromise those pipelines and obtain access to on-prem and access to the wider organization with all God mode. So it is possible to do that. We have two examples and use cases that we managed to compromise some Azure, some cloud pipelines, and pivot to the internal environment. And we also have seen that in the news. So you might have heard about Stack Overflow. So they have been breached, and I think it was 2019. And basically, hackers managed to install source code. And the bottom line was basically that they managed to compromise TeamCity account. So TeamCity is another Jenkins code fresh tool, which does the CI/CD pipeline automation. And according to them, they could not pivot from the cloud environment to the on-prem, and the exposure was very limited. And the reason they said that is because they had good segmentation between those environments. But it is another example for us to understand that those pipelines need to be well managed. The other challenge, it is that there is so many different technologies, so many different tools, that it is difficult for us to keep up with all them and understand how they work in any security concerns that we might have. And I just want to make a pause here and just share some thoughts. I guess, look, we as security professionals, there are so many things that we need to be responsible for. We need to know about network security. We need to know about policy governance and cryptography. And we also need to know about secure development in pipelines. So it is a bit difficult, and it is a lot to cover. So I guess, and because there's so many tools, so many automation, techy heavy, those methods can become challenging for us sometimes. And from my experience, what works best here is just being open and honest about those knowledge gaps, just talking to those DevOps teams, trying to understand what they're doing. And often what you're going to see is that they do have a good understanding about those potential pain points and security issues, and they might have some good ideas about how to fix them as well. So look, it's okay, and we should be talking more and we should making sure that they do understand, where we're coming from, and just collaborate with them. I do believe that that's the best way to address that specific challenge. The other thing is about, you probably have seen that some organizations, they do get some basic or some key functions to work in agile fashion, but sometimes other supporting areas, they do not have the same mandates. And that's normally the case of security, risk and compliance, procurement, so those supporting functions. And what happens is that when those functions do not have the same mandate, when we are integrating with those functions that are now operating in agile fashion, there's a lot of friction because the process and the ways that we do things just do not align with the way that they are doing their things. And yeah, often we do not change the process enough, and we just change when we start seeing the friction and seeing that things are not working, but that's normally a challenge and something that we see a lot with organizations. And finally, and kind of, linked to the, previous challenging, I guess, and I will say from my experience, I do believe that I have resisted a lot to Agile and tried to blame and try to, raise all the, cons about the ways that Agile was, doing changes and the issues that I was facing with, getting my security message across. But I guess ultimately, Agile is here. We know that for a number of years now, that's not going to change. And it's providing the organization with so many benefits that it is time. And I've been seeing a lot of, security professionals acknowledging that and trying to work with that culture, right? Knowing the constraints, knowing the difference, and trying to align as much as possible the way that we do things with the way that they do their things, and simplifying when possible. Cool. So what I want to do now is just ask you a question. We won't be voting. You might not have the opportunity to say your thoughts now, but you might be able to do. And I would love to hear your thoughts as part of the Q&A part. But I guess it's an interesting, question for us to ask ourselves. I will provide my insights, my thoughts, but once more, I'm keen to hear yours once we go to the Q&A. So the question is, if you do believe that the high rate of change associated with those agile delivery process, if they increase organization risk profile. Or just make a pause and just drink a little bit of tea as well. I guess that's an interesting question. There is no right or wrong. There is perceptions in how do you see those things and where you are in your journey to understand Agile and align security to that. I will be honest and say that before I had a different opinion, a different position, but I have changed that after having exposure to those teams and work with them closely. I do not believe today that the rate of change does increase your risk profile. And the reason that I don't believe that is because I strongly believe if security, it is implemented from the beginning, if security is part of the life cycle, actually the rate of change, the high rate of change can be beneficial because now you have the opportunity to more quickly or more efficiently identify security bugs and vulnerabilities and fix them, right? So that rate of change, can help security as well. The other reason that I don't believe that it is true, or the other reason that I believe that it is a myth, basically, it is because if we say that it is true, we are kind of implying that Agile is a problem, is the reason of the issues that we are seeing over and over in software development and all those vulnerabilities that we see quite often in the news. I guess the previous and more traditional release process, they were also flawless. They were also they also have and had and have still lots of issues, right? I don't think that's an Agile problem. I think that it is a problem that security sometimes is not part of those discussions from a very early stage. So I think that by saying that it is true, we also blame Agile in a new way of doing things, right? When that's not, in my opinion, the case. So yeah, so that's been my journey. I have been challenging in a good way for, some of the DevOps teams, because I used to say that I remember them putting forward some presentations saying that the rate of change, in the ways that Agile does think in a very quick and fast way, increase, risk exposure and those kinds of things. And I guess I had good people that helped me to get into that journey, understand that perhaps that was not, maybe it was not totally wrong, but was not a useful statement and a useful lens to see the problem. Once more, I would love to hear if you have different opinions, and even if you have the same, I would love to hear your thoughts too. Cool. So now I want to spend a bit of time here, because here is where when we start discussing DevSecOps, which is a methodology and approach to mind the security gap. And I also want to discuss some ideas of controls and things that you should be thinking of, and perhaps share my thoughts in my previous experience about, things that have worked and things that have not worked. So first of all, if we start from a DevSecOps perspective, so once more, when you talk about DevOps, we're talking about that, operating model, having those different teams working together. So by saying that we have DevSecOps, or by saying DevSecOps, you are implying that then you have security people, security teams also working as part of that DevOps team. And by the way, SecDevOps is pretty much the same, right? Unless someone says differently, my opinion is pretty much the same. It's just a different way of placing security. Some people say that by placing security at the beginning, you make sure that security is from very early stages, but it is pretty much the same thing. And a couple of things. So DevSecOps implies the operating model and having those people working together. And here I have a couple of thoughts, a couple of struggles that I have had before, which I would like to perhaps share with you all. So the first one is that having security people as part of the DevOps teams is beautiful. And look, it is a very good approach, right? Having them living and breathing that day to day and knowing the change from the very beginning, being part of those conversations. But the reality is that we have a significant shortage of security people worldwide, right? And we normally don't have enough people, security people within the organization. So it is very difficult, and it is very challenging to be in a position that you can assign people to work with those teams, most of their times, right? We just don't have enough security people. The other challenge is that normally when you talk about DevSecOps, you are talking about security. We're talking about engineers, right? We talk about developers, focus engineers. We're talking about operating focus engineers. We're talking about security engineers. And I remember sharing that with a friend of mine that he might be here because he does like, the DevSecOps talk. Sharing with him, saying, look, we need to have security engineers as part of those DevOps teams. And he laughed on me and saying, do they exist? Do we have security engineers? And I guess he had a point, we might have some, but that's pretty rare. We are still developing that type of role. And I guess it's not something that we do have, right? And I have talked to peers of mine, saying that they were struggling to find people with those skills, right? And because that's the reality, we have that shortage of security skills in the whole world. And from my experience in being in some management positions as well, the other challenge that I experienced with embedding security people as part of those teams is that then what you do, because you don't have enough people to assign to individual teams, you kind of spread them across multiple teams. But then the other problem that you have is that they then cannot attend those key ceremonies, those daily stand-ups. They cannot be part of those things, and they end up actually being not having the understanding about all of those things that are being done, and can put some pressure on them as well, right? Because then they are supposed to be responsible for that DevOps, for that application, but they're not part of that team, because they have so many other things that need to be overseen. And then they just feel bad, and they just don't feel that they are achieving things and doing, a very comprehensive security assurance job because of all those constraints. So what I'm trying to say, it is very challenging from those aspects. So the reality is that if we don't have enough people, if we potentially cannot afford having security people embedded in some of those teams, the reality is that we do need to look at CI/CD pipelines, and we do need to look at automating our security checks as much as possible, right? So that's the solution normally. Two things that from my experience, I believe that we should all be thinking. So the first one, automate as much as possible, always looking at opportunities to have that as part of those pipelines. And if you cannot automate, then you should be looking at simplifying, right? Cool. So what I want to do now as well is just quickly discuss and pick some of those stages and review some of those controls and perhaps share a bit of thought and a bit of previous experience once more about things that I have seen that worked. So if we look at the planning stage, and then we have in there, a few controls, being the first one, security by design, which is basically, make sure that security is involved in a very early stage and requirements are being embedded as part of the change, from the beginning. We have lightweight risk assessments, which is key, right? So we cannot be running around with huge spreadsheets with lots of questions. There is no way that, the developers are going to be happy or is going to work, if we ask them to complete forms. So we need to have more light ways of doing risk assessments. And finally, threat modeling, right? Threat modeling, it is something that more and more organizations are using, but it is not as much used, in my opinion. And it is so beneficial, right? Because you kind of, start having that, hacker mindset on how you can break things, how you can subvert things. And that's so important for you to make sure that whatever you are doing, building or changing, it is secure. But the reality is that even some of those controls might not be the best, option for some of the change that, your DevOps teams are doing. So threat modeling, for example, it is a very good, tool for high-level change or for, the likes of, the initiative level or maybe even the epic level. Because as you probably know, those DevOps teams, they split, they break the initiatives into initiatives, which are, high-level statements. Then you have the epics, and then under the epics, you are going to have the user stories, which are very specific changes, right? So threat modeling might work with those high-level, change, statements and objectives. But when you are working with stories, for example, even if you are using a very consolidated, simple, threat modeling methodology, it's just not going to work, right? And some of those frameworks and some of those methodologies, they provide some ideas on how do you address that, because effectively you do need to have some oversight on those user stories as well. And there's a few things that they provide as a suggestion, right? One being having specific security stories as part of their release, or having security acceptance criteria as part of each one of those individual stories. From my experience, I have tried both, and I have not obtained success with those two suggestions. And the reason is because the first one about having those generic security stories, the issue is that it is generic. It is too generic that, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. And with regards to having security acceptance criteria as part of individual stories, it is good, it is normally a best option. But then we go back to the problem that we were discussing just before, with the fact that if you are doing that, and in order for you to have like comprehensive, criteria, you need to understand each one of these stories. So potentially you do need to have a security person reviewing all those stories. But again, you just don't have enough security people. You can't potentially afford having people reviewing every single story that every single, DevOps teams that you have are doing. What I have seen that worked, and that was for one of the organizations that I worked with, and that was something that my team basically has done even before I joined, which was quite cool, was having something that we called guide rails, which would be like checklists, I don't like the word checklist, but was pretty much like a checklist with some very simple question, pointed questions, yes and no, which, depending on the outcome of that checklist, you would involve, or depending on the outcome, you would require to involve a security professional or not. And the nice thing about that is that, one, those guide rails would be done specifically for the applications that those DevOps teams were managing. in conjunction with those DevOps teams. And finally, that checklist, that assessment would be done by the DevOps teams, right? So it would be done by them. So effectively, we would be empowering them to assess and make a decision, right? So, which is quite important because, as I said before, there's so many nuances, there's so many applications. We do need to have, in some level, ability to empower those teams to make some decisions and to be responsible for security as well. The other one that I want to quickly discuss perhaps with you is about Operate, which is another interesting one as well. And I want to share some thoughts with my journey and things that I have come across. So Operate, you know, it's quite important. And often I do believe that we are quite good now to understand, you know, controls and the importance of have security in the pipeline, right? And I will explain in a minute what I mean by in the pipeline. But not so often we have the same mindset for the security of the pipeline. And it's important that sometimes we break those two concepts because they do provide some insight. So when we are security in the pipeline is basically making sure that the changes that we are doing to the software, to the applications, they are not introducing bugs or security vulnerabilities, right? And we are kind of good with that. We do, most of organizations, they have some tools to assess the source code and to make sure that those changes are in line with those, you know, best security practices. But when we talk about the security of the pipeline, which is effectively, you know, the pipeline itself, you know, making sure that all those tools that you are seeing on the screen, they have configured, they are implemented in a proper way, that we do understand the trust relationship between them, that we do have login monitor, that we do have, you know, change in control. Those things often are a bit overlooked. And I have been across, you know, discussions with some of the DevOps teams where they were saying, look, I'm just doing a change in my pipeline, I'm not doing a change in the application, right? As if the pipeline was not something critical, was not something important to. I guess we have defined already that it is a critical piece of infrastructure, and therefore we do need to have a good security oversight and making sure that those things are working properly, right? So then if you look at the controls that we have, you know, on top of operating, we have access control. So really making sure the access has been done in a proper way, privilege accounts, you know, all that stuff is being managed. Vulnerability and patch management. So yeah, vulnerability, we should be assessing, you know, dependencies, libraries, and all those things that we are using as part of the security in the pipeline, you know, the application itself. But we should also be looking at, you know, those same aspects for the pipeline and the applications that we are using across the pipeline. And changing control, right? So we should have processes in place that can provide us with some systematic approach to doing change, because there is a mindset and sometimes a willingness for those teams to just apply change as they go, but we do need to have some consistency because the failure of that pipeline can impact, you know, different things. And of course, as always, when possible, we should have some way of enforcing those controls, right? Or monitoring those controls. So very important that you as an organization, you have the ability to detect any unauthorized change or things like that. Just then very quickly, I actually want to talk about release just very quickly as well. We do have in there penetration testing and security sign-offs. I guess that's another one that's quite interesting as well, because with those pipelines and with those changes, you probably will not be able to do a pen test every single time, because again, if you are releasing on weekly basis or daily basis, you know, depending on your business, you just don't have enough time to do a pen test sometimes, right? So so the general and what I've seen working fine for some organizations is that if you are not changing critical flows, if you are not changing like authorization and authentication type of flows or any critical business logic, you might waive a penetration test, and you might look at other opportunities in a more efficient way of doing that. So things that I have seen that worked in the past was basically then having a schedule and testing the entire application on a regular basis. So for example, each quarter you test a different, you know, part of the application. and once every 6 months or once a year, you would then do a comprehensive, testing of the whole application. So then you make sure that you are testing all those chains that are being, applied to the application. Security sign-offs, again, so you should be looking at automating those things. So some of the things that I have seen working in the past is having some sort of application or automation where you can consolidate all the results of the previous phases. So let's say that you have done source code, security review. So we would upload that in an automatic way into that tool. Let's say that we have done dependency, analysis to make sure that you're not using any vulnerable libraries or things like that. And if all those results of all those, assessments were green, were positive, then you could go ahead and do the release. If they were amber or red, depending on your risk appetite, then that would require security sign-off or senior management sign-off as well. Cool, sorry, we don't have the time to review every single control. If you do have any questions about some of those specific controls, yeah, please let me know, reach out. But I guess it is just, some ideas. Finally, what I want to say is that very important that you are talking to those teams, because ultimately, as I just said, there are some good ideas out there, things that have worked for other organizations, but does not mean that those controls and those, ideas will work for your organization. So having security as part of their model and in those practices does require some level of customization. So the best way that you can do that is keep talking to them, trying things out and changing as well. Okay, so next slide. Cool. You might, so the other thing that happens a lot and has happened with me is that sometimes we are saying over and over, sharing our concerns, but no one is listening. No one listens to us, right? No one, seems to understand what we are talking and why we are so concerned about some of those things. So if that's the case, if that's happening with you, so you might look, a good idea perhaps it is engage with some, experts, out there and try to see if you can do like a comprehensive pipeline security review. Or you could potentially also be looking at like a compromise type of assessment. All those assessments can help you to inform the needs and the priority and the importance for the senior management to start doing investments on that space. I guess we all have been in a situation where we have made several recommendations and no one listened to us. Suddenly there is an external consultant, firm that comes in, says the same thing, or just, copy and paste, or just, documents whatever we have been saying. And then, senior management start, paying attention, noise starts happening and things, sometimes, change. So yeah, I would say, if that's the case, you should perhaps be looking at, doing like a formal assessment just to get an independent opinion about the security of those pipelines and models. Cool, conscious with time. So I just want to quickly review key, thoughts and key points that I guess is important for us to keep in mind. I guess we kind of determine the importance of those pipelines and how critical they are. So those pipelines, it's very important that you do understand that they can be used to compromise the wider organization. So you should be making sure that they have like, security controls around it and they have some level of security hygiene. Very important that you do redesign your process. It is important as well that you think about ways of simplifying and when possible automating as well. I think that's quite important. So the purpose of any security team or any security professional, it is to make sure that we reduce the risk to an acceptable level. There is no such a thing as eliminating or risk zero. So as long as you are formalizing, documenting there, if someone is happy with going ahead, if they believe that, they cannot lose the opportunity of, releasing a new feature or, providing something else to their customer, I think it is fine. We do need to acknowledge that sometimes security is not the most important thing. And here is the importance of, making sure that as a security professional, you do understand two things. So the first one, it is what is your organization risk appetite? You should seek and you should be challenging your leaders to provide you with that view, you know, because that will inform also what's your authority as a security professional, right? Because we want to make sure that you're not signing off things that you should not be signing off, right? Perhaps, and for some organizations, you know, they are comfortable with low risks, right? And they might be comfortable with you signing off low risks, but they might not be comfortable with medium and high. So having that understanding is quite important for you performing your role. And other organizations might have a very, you know, high tolerance, and part of your job is seeking to understand those things. And finally, I guess, look, there's so much benefits with those agile methodologies. There has been so much innovation and improvement. So why not we, as security professionals in security functions, not start to embed some of those concepts, you know, using some of the automation in goods to improve the way that we work. That's all, and I guess we can go to the Q&A.
Awesome, Vanessa. Look, thank you so much for taking the time and for putting the presentation together and sharing your thoughts and experiences. I guess just for everyone on the call, if you do have any questions, please pop them at the chat. I think Vanessa and I will hang around for at least for a couple of minutes and see if there are any takers. And now that I've said that, there was a question from earlier in the chat, Vanessa, and I'm just going to read it out. The question goes along the lines of, aside from overall general security framework policies, are there recommendations for specific CI platforms? I would just cut that back to say, if you do have an example in mind around a specific continuous integration platform, and perhaps some recommendations that you might have thought of in the past, it's an opportunity to share those.
Yeah, of course. So look, there's so much out there, you know, that you can leverage from. There's so much thinking. If you Google, you know, that there's so many people talking about that, because it is really a pain point. And there's so much thing that we can do. You know, there's also one of the things I have not mentioned, but there is lots of, you know, open source type of tools that you can, if you don't have budget, you know, big budgets, you can be looking at integrating with your pipeline. You don't need to go crazy and expensive with those expensive tools that we all know and we have heard. There is a lot of, you know, simple things in scriptures that you can incorporate. And once more, those DevOps teams, they do know those things. So that is the importance of keep talking to them, right? The final thing I would say is that, look, there is lots of, you know, potential good controls, but it is case by case. You need to work with them and understand, you know, the way that those things have been implemented in your organization. And I guess that's the best way, you know, to go about addressing those problems. If some of the people that are in the call, they want to reach out to me, I can share more about, you know, tools that I have used, you know, and things I have seen that worked fine for the organizations that I have worked with. But once more, everything starts with talking to those teams, understanding what they have in mind, and work with them to see what can be done from a security perspective.
Awesome. Look, thanks again, Vanessa. I'm just going to say, looking with an eye on the time, I think we're going to take a pause on Q&A. For everyone's benefit, the session will be recorded. If you do wish to reach out to Vanessa, obviously you can reach out via LinkedIn. If you wish to reach out to myself, you're welcome to do the same thing in terms of any type of follow-up questions or detail. Would love to take them on. Just a quick reminder for everyone on the call, we have our final session in this tranche of Secposium coming up next week with Adam Wallow, presenting on the history of everything. For some of you that might have heard Adam present before, I think you'd appreciate that he always has an interesting perspective on security in general, but in this particular case, talking about the history and evolution of security going back to the beginning of time. I won't steal his thunder by sharing his perception of the beginning of time, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Look forward to seeing you all next week and enjoy what's left of this week. Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks again.
Thanks, you. That's all good. Thank you, guys, and hope to talk to you at some point soon. Bye.